Welcome back, folks, to part 5 on our ecology unit. It's 8.7 Disruptions to Ecosystems. This is the very last section of notes and the very last topic in the AP Bio curriculum. So, yay, we made it. All right, so there's some general presuppositions that you got to keep in mind as we get into this topic that we've covered earlier in this unit or earlier in the course. Um, just some stuff about evolution, guys. Remember that evolution is characterized by change in the genetic makeup of a population over time. And we got a lot of different evidence for that, right? And what we're looking for is those changes in genetic makeup often lead to an adaptation that is favored by selection and then is manifested as a trait that provides an advantage to an organism in a particular environment. So the adaptation gives it an advantage in that particular environment. Okay? Mutations are random and are not directed by specific environmental pressures. All right, take a minute and think about this. How are these concepts relative to a topic that deals with disruptions to ecosystems? Pause it and think. Well, yeah, disruptions to ecosystems are going to make it harder to survive, right? If you're disrupting what things are adapted to, by definition, they're not going to be as well adapted to the new situation. So these changes, this disruption, um, affects those adaptations and affects the evolution of organisms. It may cause them to go extinct. It may cause them to adapt to new types of environments. It may make them hardier, more adaptable, more of a generalist, so to speak, is what we can see there. Competition and cooperation are important aspects of biological systems. How is this concept relative to a topic that deals with disruptions? Pause it and get back. Yeah, so when you are evolving, okay, and you're evolving to compete with other organisms for certain resources or to cooperate within your own species or between species to gather the resources you need, if those ecosystems and those resources are being disrupted, um, that's going to change the level of competition. Who's got a slight advantage? Who doesn't? It's going to change, how well that cooperation works and such, right? All right, so let's get into it. This is in your book on that section 54.3. So, disturbance influences species diversity and composition. So, how much diversity is out there and what types of species are living somewhere? Decades ago, most ecologists favored the view that communities are generally in a state of equilibrium. You're probably familiar with as the balance of nature. Nature is always balanced. More lately, we've come to embrace the non-equilibrium model. Um, and with that, we've got a disturbance is an event that changes a community by either removing organisms from it or altering resource availability. Okay, so flood, fire, clear cutting, a volcano, a storm, whatever. Okay. So now we're looking at a non-equilibrium model, which describes communities as constantly changing after being buffeted by disturbances. So they're striving to get to an equilibrium. That's where the communities want to get to. But every time they get there, or they get close, or sometimes not every time, sometimes way before they get close to equilibrium, another disturbance will come in and mess things up. And they're trying to get back to equilibrium again. And then another disturbance will come and mess things up. All right, so we can characterize disturbance a little bit by high and low level disturbance. Okay, and we can do that. We can look at the frequency, like how often do disturbances happen somewhere? Is it a very volatile climate where things can happen often? And or the severity of the disturbance. How bad is it? Do we completely wipe out all living things, or do we just make it hard for a few things? So a high level disturbance is usually the result of a high intensity and a high frequency of disturbance. So something that's very destructive, okay, and happens often, like repeated devastating wildfires, which is not uncommon in parts of the West. Or low levels of disturbance can result from low frequency. They don't happen very often, and or when they do happen, they're not that big of a deal. So the intermediate disturbance hypothesis states that moderate levels of disturbance can foster greater diversity than either high or low levels. Okay, so look here, number of taxa. So this is kind of our diversity, right? How many different types of organisms we have there. Um, and here's our scale of disturbance intensity: really intense, low intense. And you can see where we have the most diversity is kind of in the middle on the disturbance. So we seem to have the most diversity in the middle of kind of our disturbance intensity. Why do you think that might be? Pause it and let's talk. Well, on the high end, high levels of disturbance may exclude many slow growing species, right? If you take too long to grow and reach maturity, if the disturbance is coming too often, you're never going to be able to survive to maturity and reproduce, right? So you're not going to be able to get those slow growing species, or the disturbance is just so devastating that hardly anything is able to cope with it, and it keeps killing off most things. On the other end of the spectrum, low levels of disturbance uh, might be too weak, and that allows dominant species to just kind of take over. It's like we are just slightly better than you in our resource acquisition. If we didn't have a lot of time, that'd be fine. We'd probably balance out. But since we've got all the time in the world before disturbances, we can completely dominate this area, and nobody else can compete with us, so they're all gone. Okay, so there's too little disturbance to hold the dominant species in check and let other ones try to get a start. All right, and that brings us to succession. What happens? So ecological succession is the sequence of community changes after disturbance. Okay, so after disturbance, what type of organisms thrive, which ones don't, and what comes after that, and what comes after that. How does the environment or habitat change after disturbance? Primary succession occurs when no soil exists when succession begins. So we're talking about you got bare rock, no living organism or soil for plants to take root in. Think a volcano, right? New islands, or a glacier will retreat. Okay, those would leave no soil, everything scraped clean. How does that work? That's primary succession. In primary succession, the early arriving species and the late arriving species may be linked in one of three processes. So those early arriving species, there's usually not many of them, and they're usually not super productive, right? Because they don't have much for resources to rely on. They're on bare rock and limited soil, so they've got to be able to handle those conditions, right? So those early arrivals may facilitate the appearance of later species by making the environment more favorable, maybe starting to develop soil in the area, for instance, or putting nitrogen into the soil. Some cases, those early arriving species may inhibit the establishment of later species. They're saying, I'm here first, you guys stay out. And it does something to keep the later species from coming in, or it tries to anyway, right? Or the early arriving species may be just fine. They tolerate the later species, but don't have no real impact on their establishment. This is the one that we usually think about and see when we're talking about primary succession. So here's an example. In Glacier Bay in Alaska, the glaciers have been retreating over time. So we can see up here, this is where the glacier retreated most recently, 1941. And we see here, we can see almost completely bare, right? And just a few really hardy species coming in there. Those are the early arrivers. They're pioneering a new location. This one here had about 30 years further along. And we can see we get these tough shrubby type things growing in. There's enough soil after this to allow these guys to take root and start to grow. After that, okay, or before that, after that, I should say, we're about 50 years on here, you're going to get the alder stage up there. So this has made the soil, added more nitrogen to the soil, added more soil, allowing bigger things to start forming, like alders. Alders will still add nitrogen to the soil, so they're still amending the soil, they're still making more soil, okay, which is then going to allow spruce to come in, and then the spruce come in, and the hemlocks come in, and then, I didn't show it in this picture, but eventually if there's areas where there's poor drainage, the spruce and the hemlock will kind of die out and they get taken over by sphagnum moss, and you get some mossy bogs because it's too wet and that mossiness will hold the water, which makes it too wet for the trees. So you wind up with mossy bogs in the low area, spruce in the higher areas, the well-drained areas, and you start to see what we would consider a mature forest for the area. Okay. Now, that's primary succession when after you've had complete nothing left, right? Secondary succession, we tend to see more often. That's after more less devastating disturbances. Um, Secondary succession begins in an area where soil remains after the disturbance. Think a fire. Okay, like in Yellowstone National Park, there's big fires that go through once in a while, and after that, things come back fairly quickly because there's still soil around. In fact, the fire often um, helps amend the soil, make the soil in better shape for plants, kind of rejuvenates the soil, and allows some plants need fire to release their seeds. They're so well adapted to a high fire environment that if they don't get fire, they can't reproduce. Because after a fire, they've evolved so that the fire wipes out their competition, makes the soil really good, and that heat from the fire is what activates their seeds and allows them to open up, and they can start growing. So they need fire to start. There's some species like that that are fire not only fire tolerant but fire dependent in some ecosystems. Another example of secondary succession is you've probably all seen it. If you pay attention to an area long enough around you, we have it all the time around here, right? Where we have agricultural land that some farmer decides this little corner is not worth plowing anymore, or they return it back to fallow or whatever, and they'll stop plowing it, and then you'll have some grasses and things, wind blown seeds, and berry bushes and stuff that birds drop little seeds that can get in there easily. They'll start to grow, and that forms a stable enough soil base and gives enough time for slightly woodier plants to start growing, some bushes and some quick growing trees. And then those will get replaced by eventually the slower growing trees like oaks and maples, and then return back to what this area used to be, which was either eastern deciduous forest or oak savanna. Humans have the greatest impact on biological communities worldwide at this point, in both terrestrial land and marine ecosystems. Um, we clear cut forests, we plow up prairies, we dredge the ocean floor. Um, so where we have human disturbance, it's usually pretty big, and it's going to generally reduce species diversity. Where humans show up, species diversity drops. All right, time for the last section on the last topic in the last unit in AP Bio, guys. 56.4, where we're going to look at human actions affecting change. So human caused change in the environment, besides what we've already talked about with just, clear cutting and things of that nature, dredging on the ocean floor, human caused changes in the fire load in forests, like when we stop fires, now the regular fires that kind of kept everything in balance, or the disturbances from being too crazy, those have changed. We got a lot more forest fires. But things like nutrient enrichment, accumulation of toxins, and chemical change are three we want to talk about specifically here. Human activity often removes nutrients from one part of the biosphere and adds them to another. So if you're growing plants on a field, they're going to suck up nutrients from the soil, put them in their biomass, we cut the plants down, we take them away, we eat them somewhere else, and they go into a landfill or compost site, right? But now those nutrients are not in the soil where they grew. Where if it was in nature, the plants would grow, they'd thrive, they'd die, and the nutrients would return back to the soil. So we are moving nutrients around in nature artificially. So that will deplete the nutrients in the soil. So then we add fertilizers to the soil to try to replace some of those nutrients, not all of them, but some of them. And so now we're adding way more of those nutrients to the soil. Okay, that can be a problem if we exceed the critical load, which is the amount of added nutrient that can be absorbed by plants without damaging ecosystem integrity. So if we add too much, the plants can't absorb them. The excess nutrients leach into groundwater and run off into aquatic systems. Then that agricultural runoff and the sewage that has those extra nutrients that we took those nutrients from this farm field, took them to the city, everybody ate them, flushed them down the toilet, and now that sewage has those nutrients. That can lead to phytoplankton blooms in the ocean and and other algae blooms in lakes and streams. And what happens then? Those phytoplankton have tons of nutrients, so they just go crazy. Okay, they got plenty of nutrients, so their population just goes way high. Then they die off, and when they die off, they sink to the bottom. Then they get decomposed. Well, here I'll show you on the next slide here. So we get all these sources of extra nutrients going into the water. We get a bloom, an algae bloom, if we're talking about a lake. Then the algae die off, they sink to the bottom. Decomposition winds up using up all the oxygen down there because we got tremendous amounts of decomposition, and especially on the lower parts of the lake, it's harder to get oxygen all the way down there. Relatively easy near the surface, but not near the bottom. So the oxygen goes away. Then the local fish and things like that don't have enough oxygen, so they either die or they have to move away, and we get a dead zone. Okay, so we basically kill off a whole part of the ecosystem down there. Another problem that can occur is the buildup of toxins in the environment. Right now, as the recording of this video, the buildup of PFAS, chemicals in the environment is a big concern, and there's a lot of battles going on about how much should be allowed or not allowed in soils and water tables and things like that. So we release toxic chemicals, including things that have never been known by nature before. And in some cases, those can persist for long periods of time in the ecosystem, years, decades, in the case of PFAS, centuries. Okay, so once they're in the environment, they're going to always be in the environment for those forever chemicals. Okay, so as long as there's not too many in the soil or water, is that big of a deal? Well, it kind of is because of something called biomagnification. So if this is the concentration in the water, the lower parts of the food chain, they accumulate it, and these chemicals don't get excreted in their waste products, so they don't get returned back to the water right away. They stay in their biomass, so which means all that biomass goes into these fish, and they get absorbed by the fish, and then the fish get absorbed in the bird, and what we're doing is just accumulating more and more and increasing the concentration more and more as we move up the food chain. And that's part of the reason in some lakes and rivers, you shouldn't eat the bigger fish, or you shouldn't eat the fish all that often because of the bioaccumulation, because the buildup of some of these toxins, lead and PFAS and other things, it accumulates in those higher level species, and then we're eating too much. So there's often warnings, especially on predator fish, like if we're sport fishing for fish that are big predators, you can eat them, but you shouldn't eat them too often, kind of thing. You guys know about climate change and greenhouse gases. We've covered that in other classes and things before here at this school that you had to take before you took this, so I'm not going to get too far into it here, but due in large part to burning of fossil fuels and other human activities, atmospheric CO2 has been steadily increasing, and this is just showing from 1880 to 2010. It's way higher now, and it was way lower before 1880. But we can measure the levels of CO2 concentration going into the past with ice cores. So we can go back in time and glaciers and stuff and see what the CO2 levels were like when that particular part formed. So we've got a good record going back a couple 100,000 years, I think. And then more recently, we've gotten even more precise when we actually started directly measuring it out in the middle of the Pacific on Mount Loa, or Mauna Loa in Hawaii. But we can see the temperatures over these years. They fluctuate year to year, right? There's hotter years and there's colder years. But overall, that trend line, if you do a trend line on those temperatures, that trend line pretty much matches up exactly with CO2. Because the CO2 and the methane and these other greenhouse gases we put in the atmosphere, and excess water vapor, they kind of hang up high in the atmosphere. So the sun's energy, radiant energy, can come through the atmosphere, get through the greenhouse gases, then they bounce off the earth and come back, and they get reflected back down again. Okay, along with trapping the other excess heat that's being produced through the process of living things on this planet and human activity. The impact then is it keeps the Earth's surface. I mean, normally the greenhouse effect is good. Otherwise, we'd be the same temperature as outer space, which would be too cold. So we want to keep some heat in there, but it's a delicate balance, right? If you're too cold, no life exists. If you're too warm, no life exists. Earth is in that Goldilocks zone of temperature where we can have liquid water most of the Earth, and frozen water in some places, and we can have water vapor for rain, and we can get this water cycle going. If we get too far out of that band, we're dead. Okay, but these increasing levels of CO2 and methane and other greenhouse gases is slowly affecting global temperature. And those global temperatures then affect all sorts of things, right? It shifts the zones where organisms can survive, um, in latitude. Things that needed it really hot um, or colder, they have to move further north if they want to live. And if they can't move, they die. If they can't adapt, they die. So there's a lot of talk about the uh, anthropomorph uh, Anthropocene um, extinction. Some scientists are worried that we are getting into another mass extinction event, which is fairly rare in human history, not in human history, in Earth history. But we might be causing an anthropomorphic, meaning human-made or human-like. So we might be causing or starting a new mass extinction. Um, all sorts of issues there, but you've gotten into that. I talk forever and I shouldn't. So a few other odds and ends that we want to just address from this unit before we end things. Um, why does the introduction of invasive species often result in exponential growth, that uncontrolled straight up growth, uh, and reduce the populations of other species? Pause it, think, and then come back. Yeah, for those invasive species, they are, when they first move into an area, they don't have very many limiting factors, right? There's probably no predators that are used to hunting them. They probably have limited competition. They probably don't have diseases that they got to worry about, which all allows them to outcompete the native populations who have all the other restrictions like food availability and water availability and space availability that the invasive species has, but they also have disease and predators and all that kind of stuff. Next question for you. Do the locations of ecosystems change over time? Yes, they do. Why? Climate change definitely shifts around where it's warmer, where it's colder, where it's wetter, where it's drier. That's a big one. And generally, it's slow enough for organisms to adapt and move. But the most recent bat of climate change, which is human caused, um, definitely messes with the speed at which organisms can migrate and can adapt. And then, of course, there's continental movement. Human and other disturbance can change that, right? We can take an ecosystem and completely alter its mechanisms within just a few decades, right? By building suburbs or cutting down trees or making fields or all sorts of things like that. Habitat fragmentation, right? Rather than having vast swaths where organisms can move around and migrate and go in and out of other populations, we put big roads and cities and subdivisions and all this stuff in, and it breaks up the ecosystem and makes it difficult for organisms to get from one place to the other, which decreases their ability to have biologic diversity, to have genetic diversity, because they're kind of getting isolated from the other areas. They're not able to mate with other populations to keep the genetic variability alive. So it just messes with things. Does human impact accelerate change at both the local and global levels? Yeah. Uh, Habitat change, introduction of new diseases, and lots of other limiting factors. And that will do it, guys. That's the very last slide. What I'd like you to do now, if you haven't already done it, do the 8.7 topic questions on disruptions to ecosystems. We'll come back in class and start reviewing for the test. Thanks. Bye.